Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about something fundamental to human relationships, something that, when misunderstood, causes immense frustration, confusion, and even heartbreak. It's this question: if he wants you, why is he distant? Now, at first glance, this seems paradoxical. If someone desires connection, then logically they should pursue it, right? But human beings are not purely logical creatures. We are not simple machines that just input desire and output action. We are complex, deeply wired organisms with layers of fear, conditioning, and subconscious patterns shaping our behavior. So when a man desires you yet pulls away, it's not necessarily because he doesn't care. In fact, quite the opposite may be true. But to understand this, we need to dissect the forces at play, biologically, psychologically, and socially. When we examine human relationships, we often assume that desire should lead directly to action. If someone wants something, they should pursue it. If a man desires a woman, he should move toward her, make his intentions clear, and foster the connection. This is the simple linear logic that we apply to most of life's pursuits. If you want a job, you apply for it. If you want to get in shape, you go to the gym. But human relationships are not linear, nor are they purely rational. They are deeply embedded in biological, psychological, and social structures that shape behavior in ways that are often counterintuitive. A man's withdrawal, despite his apparent desire, is not necessarily an indication of indifference. Rather, it is often the manifestation of an internal conflict, one that he may not even be fully aware of himself. The male psyche has been shaped by thousands of years of evolutionary pressures that prioritize strength, competence, and control. In traditional societies, a man's role was that of the provider and protector, and his survival depended on his ability to maintain a certain level of composure and self-sufficiency. Expressing deep emotional vulnerability, historically, could be perceived as weakness, as an exposure to risk. And though society has evolved, these deeply ingrained patterns still operate beneath the surface. This is where the paradox emerges. The more he desires something, the more vulnerable he becomes to losing it. The stakes increase, and with that comes the fear of inadequacy, of rejection, of being consumed by emotions that he does not know how to fully articulate or process. And so, rather than move toward the source of his desire, he instinctively pulls away, not necessarily because he wants to, but because his unconscious mind perceives emotional closeness as a potential threat. This is not a logical decision. It is a reaction, a deeply rooted survival mechanism. We must also consider the impact of social conditioning. Many men have been raised with conflicting messages about emotions and relationships. On one hand, they are expected to be strong, independent, and composed. On the other, they are told that they must be emotionally expressive and open. This contradiction creates an internal dissonance, an inability to reconcile two opposing demands. If a man has not yet resolved this within himself, he may find himself retreating, not because he does not care, but because he does not yet possess the tools to navigate the emotional landscape before him. There is also the matter of self-worth. A man who has not yet built a strong foundation of confidence may feel unworthy of the relationship he desires. He may subconsciously believe that he is not yet ready, that he must first accomplish more, become more, prove something to himself or the world before he can allow himself the full experience of love. This often results in distancing behavior, pulling away not because he does not want the connection, but because he fears failing within it. If a man has tied his sense of value to his achievements, then love becomes something he must earn rather than something he can simply accept. Strength, competence, and control. These are the pillars upon which men have historically been judged, both by society and by themselves. From an evolutionary perspective, men were the protectors, the hunters, the ones who stood between chaos and order. Their ability to regulate their emotions, to remain composed in the face of danger, was directly tied to survival. The man who was too emotionally reactive, too vulnerable, too exposed, he risked everything. And so over thousands of years, this conditioning became deeply ingrained in the male psyche. But relationships require something different. They demand openness, emotional availability, and a willingness to be vulnerable. They require a man to lay down his armor, to allow himself to be seen not just as strong, but as uncertain, as flawed, as human. And here lies the fundamental problem. Vulnerability is not just difficult for many men, it feels unnatural, even threatening. It is a direct contradiction to everything they have been taught about what it means to be competent and in control. So what happens? A man meets a woman, he desires her, he feels a connection, but the closer he gets, the more exposed he becomes. Suddenly, he is no longer just in control of himself, he is entangled in something bigger, something unpredictable. His emotions, once manageable, begin to surge in ways he may not understand. The more he cares, the greater the risk. Because to truly love someone is to give them the power to hurt you. It is to hand them a weapon and trust that they will not use it. And for many men, especially those who have been conditioned to equate strength with emotional self-sufficiency, this is an unbearable prospect. So rather than confront these feelings, rather than risk the unknown, he withdraws. Not because he does not care, but because he cares too much. Not because he wants to lose her, but because the fear of loss, of failure, of inadequacy, these things become overwhelming. He is faced with a choice: lean into the discomfort of vulnerability or retreat into the familiar safety of distance. And for many, retreat feels like the only option. There's also the issue of competence. A man wants to feel that he can handle a relationship, that he can meet the needs and expectations placed upon him. But if he is unsure of his ability to do so, if he fears that he may not be enough, then avoidance becomes a form of self-protection. It is easier to withdraw than to risk being exposed as inadequate. Because if he stays and he fails, if he cannot provide the emotional depth or security that he knows is required, then what does that say about him? Men are not emotionless. They are simply trained to regulate emotions differently. They may feel deeply, but struggle to express those feelings in a way that aligns with societal expectations. This is why a man can love a woman and still distance himself, because love to him is not just a feeling, it is a responsibility, a challenge, a test of his own worth. Human beings do not enter relationships as blank slates. They bring with them histories, patterns of attachment, subconscious fears, and deeply ingrained expectations about how love should function. These patterns, often formed in childhood, shape how a person responds to intimacy, closeness, and emotional connection. And for many men, these responses are not always rational. They are automatic, deeply wired mechanisms that dictate behavior in ways that can be difficult to understand, even for the person experiencing them. Consider a man with an avoidant attachment style. Perhaps he grew up in an environment where emotional needs were not met consistently, where expressing vulnerability was dismissed, criticized, or even punished. Over time, he learned that closeness was dangerous, that depending on someone else led to disappointment or rejection. And so, as a defense, he adapted. He learned to rely solely on himself, to suppress emotional needs rather than express them. He developed a kind of self-sufficiency, not the healthy kind that fosters confidence, but the kind that walls him off from deep emotional connection. Now, fast forward to adulthood, he meets a woman, he feels something real, something strong. But the moment that closeness begins to build, his subconscious survival mechanisms activate. The emotional circuits that were wired in childhood begin to fire, sending warning signals. This is risky, this is dangerous, you are losing control. And so, he pulls away, not because he doesn't care, but because his nervous system is telling him that caring too much is a threat. Then there is the man with an insecure attachment style, one who learned that love is conditional, that it must be earned through constant effort, that approval is fleeting and can be withdrawn at any moment. He may crave connection, even chase it, but the moment he gets too close, the fear of inadequacy takes over. He wonders, am I enough? What if I fail? What if I get hurt? And rather than face those questions, he would rather sabotage the connection on his own terms than risk experiencing rejection at the hands of someone else. This is not a conscious choice. It is not a calculated decision to hurt or confuse. It is an unconscious script playing out, one written long before the relationship even began. And if a man has never examined these patterns, if he has never faced his own emotional history, then he will continue to repeat them, even when they lead to outcomes he does not truly want. There is another factor to consider, and that is how men process emotions differently. Women, generally speaking, are more inclined toward emotional expression, toward verbalizing thoughts and feelings as a means of understanding them. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to internalize, retreating into solitude, into silence, as a way of making sense of their own emotional states. So when a man withdraws, it is often not because he wants to leave, but because he is struggling to process something that feels overwhelming, something that challenges his understanding of himself. Men exist within a paradox of expectation. They are told to be strong, but not too strong. They must be independent, but also emotionally available. They should lead, but not control. They must be decisive, yet accommodating. And this creates an impossible standard, one that breeds internal conflict, self-doubt, and ultimately withdrawal. When a man pulls away despite his desire for connection, it is often because he is struggling to reconcile these contradictory demands. For most of human history, a man's value was determined by his competence, his ability to provide, to protect, to assert control over his environment. His emotions were secondary to his function. A warrior who hesitated due to emotional distress was a liability. A leader who allowed his fears to dictate his actions was weak. And while society has changed, the underlying expectations placed upon men have not disappeared. They have simply become more complex, more contradictory, more difficult to navigate. The modern man is expected to be emotionally intelligent and vulnerable, but also strong and self-sufficient. He must express his feelings, but not too much, lest he be seen as weak. He must be in control, but not controlling. He must be confident, but not arrogant. And so, when faced with a relationship, a dynamic that demands both emotional depth and stability, he may find himself overwhelmed. Many men, particularly those who have not been taught how to process emotions in a healthy way, default to withdrawal as a coping mechanism. This is not an act of malice or indifference. It is a strategy for maintaining equilibrium. If a man feels that he is failing to meet expectations, either his own or those imposed by society, he may step back, not because he does not care, but because he fears that he is not enough. This fear is often compounded by the reality that many men have been raised without the emotional tools necessary to navigate complex relationships. Women, generally speaking, are socialized from a young age to discuss their feelings, to seek support, to process emotions through dialogue. Men, on the other hand, are often taught to solve problems independently, to suppress discomfort, to equate emotional regulation with silence. And so, when they find themselves in emotionally demanding situations, they resort to the one tool they know: distance. This is further complicated by the fact that men are often judged not by their intentions but by their actions. A man who struggles to communicate is not seen as someone in need of guidance or support. He is labeled emotionally unavailable, distant, detached. But in many cases, his withdrawal is not a rejection of love. It is a response to the fear of inadequacy, the fear of failing as a partner, the fear of being unable to balance the weight of expectation. He is not absent because he does not care. He is absent because he is caught in the tension between what he feels and what he believes he is supposed to be. When a man becomes distant, the instinctive reaction is often to close the gap, to reach out, to demand clarity, to seek reassurance. This is natural because distance feels like a threat. It triggers a primal fear of abandonment, of rejection, of losing something valuable. And yet, the paradox is this: chasing a withdrawing man often leads to more distance, not less, because when he steps back, he is not always seeking escape. Sometimes he is seeking space to process. And how you respond to that distance determines the future of the relationship far more than the distance itself. One of the most important things to understand is that his withdrawal is not necessarily about you. It may feel personal, it may feel like a rejection, but often it is an internal struggle playing out in real time. If a man is wrestling with his emotions, his identity, his sense of competence within the relationship, then pushing him for answers before he has them will only reinforce his uncertainty. He does not want to speak before he understands what he is feeling. He does not want to make promises before he is sure he can keep them. And so, rather than forcing him to engage on your terms, you must learn to hold your ground on your own terms. This is where boundaries become essential. There is a difference between giving a man space to process his emotions and tolerating emotional neglect. The former is an act of patience and self-respect. The latter is an erosion of self-worth. If a man pulls away temporarily, allow him that time, but do not abandon yourself in the process. Do not place your entire emotional well-being in his hands, waiting for him to return before you feel secure again. You must cultivate a sense of stability that is independent of his presence. This is difficult because it requires an acceptance of uncertainty. It requires the willingness to let go of control, to trust that if he values you, he will find his way back. And if he does not, if his distance is not temporary but a pattern, a habit, a refusal to engage in emotional intimacy, then that too is an answer. A man who is truly invested in you will return with clarity, with intention. A man who is not will continue to drift, no matter how much you chase. And this is the ultimate test, not just for him, but for you. Can you hold yourself together in the face of his uncertainty? Can you resist the urge to shrink, to plead, to contort yourself in an effort to bring him closer? Because love is not meant to be chased. Love is not something you must convince someone to give. It must be freely chosen. And a man who values you, who truly sees your worth, will not allow distance to become permanent. He will step forward, not because he was pressured, but because he realizes that losing you is a cost he is not willing to pay. When a man distances himself, it is easy to fall into the trap of self-doubt. Did I do something wrong? Was I too much? Not enough? These are the questions that surface when uncertainty takes hold. And yet, the reality is often far more complex. A man's withdrawal is not always about the relationship itself. It is frequently about his own unresolved internal struggles, his fears, his sense of identity, and his place in the world. Understanding this is crucial because it shifts the focus from self-blame to self-awareness. A fundamental truth about human nature is that people project their internal conflicts onto external situations. If a man does not feel stable within himself, if he is wrestling with doubt about his direction, his purpose, his competence, then even the most loving and secure relationship can feel like pressure. This is not because the relationship is flawed, but because he has not yet solidified his own foundation. A man who is unsure of himself will find it difficult to fully commit to another, not because he lacks feeling, but because deep down he does not trust himself to succeed in the role that love requires of him. This is why when a man withdraws, the most important thing you can do is not to collapse into fear, but to observe. Is this a temporary retreat or a pattern of avoidance? Is he stepping back to gain clarity, or is he running from responsibility? Because there is a crucial difference between a man who needs time to process and a man who is unwilling to face his own emotional landscape. One is doing the work, the other is avoiding it. And you are not responsible for dragging someone into emotional maturity if they are unwilling to walk that path themselves. This is where self-respect must take precedence over fear. If you beg for clarity where none is being offered, you reinforce the idea that love is something to be earned through effort rather than something that flows naturally between two people who are equally willing participants. A man who truly values you will not allow his fears to dictate the relationship indefinitely. He may step back, but he will return with intention. If he does not, then the truth is simple: he was not ready or willing to meet you at the level of emotional depth you deserve. And this is not a reflection of your worth. Too often people internalize another person's uncertainty as a sign that they themselves are lacking. But that is not the case. A person's ability to love is determined by their own capacity for self-awareness, responsibility, and emotional growth. If a man is distant, it does not mean you were not enough. It means he was not ready to step into what the relationship required of him, and that ultimately is his burden to bear, not yours. There is a fundamental truth about human relationships that people often overlook. You cannot force someone to be ready for something they are not prepared to face. A man's distance, his hesitation, his uncertainty, these are not puzzles for you to solve. They are reflections of his internal state, his unresolved conflicts, his capacity, or lack thereof, to engage in a relationship at the level that you deserve. And the most difficult yet necessary realization is this: you must be willing to walk away if his actions show that he is not capable of meeting you where you stand. This is not about punishment. It is not about ultimatums or manipulation. It is about self-respect. It is about recognizing that love, true, meaningful love, is not about chasing or convincing. It is about mutual choice. A man who truly values you, who truly understands the depth of what he has in front of him, will not leave you in a constant state of doubt. He will not make you question where you stand. He will not require you to shrink, to wait indefinitely, to compromise your own emotional well-being just to keep the connection alive. But this is precisely where so many people struggle, because the fear of losing someone, even someone who is inconsistent, often feels greater than the fear of losing oneself. There is a tendency to rationalize distance, to excuse it, to believe that if you just try harder, if you give more, if you are more patient, if you prove your worth, then he will finally see it. But that is not how love works. Love does not thrive in a space of imbalance. It cannot grow when one person is constantly reaching while the other remains uncertain. A man's readiness for a relationship is not something you can control. He must come to that conclusion on his own, through his own experiences, through his own internal work. And if he is not willing to do that work, if he continues to distance himself, to waver, to keep you in a cycle of doubt, then the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to participate. Not as a strategy, not as a way to elicit a reaction, but as an act of self-preservation. Walking away does not mean you did not care. It does not mean you were unwilling to fight for the relationship. It means you recognize that love should not require you to lose yourself in the process. It means you chose to believe that you are worthy of something secure, something certain, something built on a foundation stronger than mere potential. And if he realizes after you have stepped away that he is willing to meet you with clarity and intention, then that is his decision to make. But it must come from him, not from pressure, not from fear, not from the threat of loss, but from a genuine recognition that you are someone worth stepping up for. And if he does not come to that realization, then the truth is simple: he was never ready to begin with. Fear of vulnerability and the male psyche. Men, evolutionarily speaking, have been conditioned to provide, protect, and perform. Strength and competence are highly valued attributes, and like it or not, we still carry these evolutionary pressures within us. A man's ability to remain composed, independent, and unshaken has been linked to his status and survival. Now, here's where the conflict arises. Emotional intimacy requires vulnerability. It demands an openness that, to many men, feels dangerous. Admitting deep feelings, expressing dependence, or surrendering to love can feel like relinquishing control, and that triggers discomfort, perhaps even terror. So what does he do? He withdraws, not because he doesn't care, but because he does. The greater the emotional stakes, the higher the fear of loss or inadequacy. Attachment styles, a psychological perspective. Modern psychology tells us that people develop attachment styles based on their childhood experiences. A man with an avoidant attachment style may deeply crave love, but the moment he feels it getting too close, he instinctively backs away. This isn't a conscious choice. It's a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. Alternatively, a man with an insecure attachment style may fear that his worth isn't enough, and instead of moving toward intimacy, he distances himself to protect his ego. He tells himself, If I pull away first, I can't be hurt. Now, does this mean all men who withdraw are emotionally unavailable? No. Some men withdraw not because they fear commitment, but because they are trying to process their own emotions in solitude, a masculine form of problem solving that is often misunderstood. The pressure of expectation. But there's another element at play here. We live in a time where men are increasingly scrutinized in their roles, in relationships. They are expected to be strong, but also emotionally available, confident, but also deeply in touch with their feelings, dominant, yet empathetic. It's an impossible balancing act. So, when a man becomes distant, he may not be rejecting you at all. He may be stepping back to recalibrate, to make sense of his emotions in a world that gives him conflicting messages about what it means to be a man. So, what can you do? First, recognize that his distance is not necessarily about you. Do not take it as a personal rejection. Instead of reacting with fear or chasing, respond with self-respect. Give him space, but maintain your boundaries. If a man truly values you, he will return. If he does not, then his distance was never about temporary uncertainty. It was a sign of his inability to love you properly. More importantly, look for patterns. If a man consistently pulls away and refuses to communicate, that is a different issue altogether, one that suggests he is not emotionally mature enough for a healthy relationship. Final thoughts. The truth is, love is not about immediate gratification. It is a slow unraveling of who we are, revealing both our light and our darkness. A man's distance does not always mean disinterest. Often, it signals his battle with his own nature. Your role is not to fix him. Your role is to understand the dynamics at play and decide whether his actions align with what you truly deserve. Because at the end of the day, a man who truly values you will find a way, not an excuse. Thank you.